Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
A set of goals were set up for the cleanup of the Chesapeake Bay by 2025. So how are we doing? Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The Environmental Protection Agency put the bay on what was called a pollution diet, and it was supposed to keep the states on track in cleaning up the estuary, but it appears that we are falling behind. Recently, Carl Blankenship, editor of the Bay Journal, took an extensive look at the progress and the problems that we still face ahead, and we have him on the line this morning. Welcome to the program. So where are we in terms of our goals for 2025? You seem to indicate that we may be actually a little bit further behind than we at one point thought.
Yes, the region as a whole is behind. The goal was to have achieved 60% of the nutrient reductions that they were supposed to get by 2025. They wanted to get 60% of them by 2017. And although we're on track for phosphorus, we're pretty far behind for nitrogen. Instead of 60%, they only got about 30% of the way there.
Why is it that we're behind on those two?
One is that nitrogen has always been problematic since Bay cleanup efforts started. It's always been a difficult nutrient to work with. And then the second part of the answer is that the biggest state for generating nitrogen is Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is really far off track compared to the other states. They have a lot to do by 2025.
Well, why is Pennsylvania so far behind?
Because everyone has had the easiest time reducing nitrogen from wastewater treatment plants, where it's basically upgrading plants and reducing what comes out of a pipe. It's a technological fix. And states with a lot of wastewater treatment plants have generally made a lot of progress towards the goals. Pennsylvania has much less wastewater than the other states. Only about 10% of their nitrogen comes from wastewater. That means, and they have more agriculture and more stormwater than any other state, and both those sectors have been difficult to control, and that adds up that they've been difficult to control for everybody, and so that makes the job worse in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is also, to be fair, has not put as much effort into it as the other states. They don't have the programs. They haven't put the financing into it. And, some would argue that EPA hasn't really exercised as much oversight over Pennsylvania as it could have, and that's caused them to fall far behind where they should be right now.
Because, as I understand it, that the Environmental Protection Agency getting involved, and not only the pollution diet, but just taking over in terms of getting the states to do this, that was supposed to be at least the magic bullet.
The EPA was, when they issued the cleanup plan, it's known as the total maximum daily load or the pollution diet. When that was issued in 2010, it was supposed to be more enforceable than, voluntary agreements of the past. But EPA's oversight is fairly limited. They have the most oversight over facilities that actually have a permit. Agriculture EPA does not have as much authority over agriculture as it does, say, a wastewater treatment plant, and to some extent stormwater. And so EPA didn't have as many tools to work with in Pennsylvania. Some argued that it could have been more aggressive with its permit oversight. It could have done more enforcement. It could have withheld money. Others say, that may have just more discouraged Pennsylvania from doing anything. And so that's a back and forth. But however you make the argument, the simple fact remains that Pennsylvania is significantly behind the eight ball on this effort.
So, I mean, is there something that the EPA you think then could have done? I mean, or is it just, or is there a lack of political will? I mean, is it just the domination of, say, the state capital or whatever it is be that political entities that they're just reluctant to put the money in?
In Pennsylvania, if you're talking at the state level, there's been a problem for years where the legislature has been very reluctant to raise any type of fees or make money available for anything, and it's been very difficult to squeeze money out to ramp up Bay efforts, and that's kind of resulted in the Bay putting, or the state putting significantly less money into anything. That there's less money to support farmers in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, a lot of the municipalities were left to upgrade their treatment plants on their own dime, whereas Maryland and Virginia had state grant programs to help them with the upgrades, and so money has always been a problem in Pennsylvania.
By the way, speaking about Pennsylvania, what kind of contribution does the Conowingo Dam play in all of this? I know in some of the discussions that have taken place down here over some of the environmental issues, some of the farmers have pointed to Conowingo Dam as like the major problem in comparison themselves. What kind of role does that facility play in terms of pollution?
Well, Conowingo Dam doesn't generate pollution per se because the pollution is coming from upstream. It can affect the timing of when things reach the bay. The issue with Conowingo Dam is the reservoir behind the dam used to trap a portion of the nitrogen and phosphorus coming downstream. But in the last decade or so, that reservoir filled, and instead of trapping a portion of the pollution, basically everything that comes downstream passes the dam. And because of that, when they set the cleanup goals, they didn't realize that was happening. And because they've now figured that out, that means actually even more nutrient reductions are needed to offset the impact of the dam.
Is there anything they can do about it? I mean, I know that there's some proposals to somehow figure out what to do about that.
Well, Maryland has tried to force the owner of the dam, Exelon, to pay money to offset that pollution as part of the conditions to get a new license, and that's in court right now, and no one knows how that's going to play out. Meanwhile, the states and EPA have agreed to work on a plan to find a way to offset that additional pollution, and that they will be working cooperatively on that. But that's kind of in preliminary stages right now.
Because I think I saw from a few your figures, I think in your piece was that something like 6 million additional tons of nitrogen into the bay pounds came from the dam, and I think for phosphorus is 270,000 additional. Are we stuck with that contribution and we just simply offset it somewhere else, or is there something that it can actually be done with the dam to keep maybe lower those figures?
Yeah, there's really not a lot feasible that can be done with the dam. It's a matter of finding additional nutrient reductions upstream or someplace else to offset the impact. Because, like I said, most of the nutrients, they're not being generated by the dam per se. They're stemming from the fact that what the dam once trapped is now passing through, and there's not a lot in the dam operation that can change that.
So what needs to be is, so the action then really needs to be done upstream, which is something that apparently Pennsylvania is behind.
Right. Yeah, because you could do some of the offset by reducing nutrients elsewhere, but the way the bay works, to offset Conowingo, you most efficiently would achieve those nutrient reductions if they're upstream of the dam. Reducing them from other places would actually require you to control significantly more than 6 million pounds of nitrogen.
Also, what's the story with Virginia? How are they dealing with this?
Virginia, how are they dealing
with pollution into the bay?
Virginia's doing pretty well, and Virginia benefits in large part because a higher proportion of their nitrogen came from wastewater treatment plants than any other states. And so they had a technological fix that gave them a really good head start. So Virginia I think they may be furthest along. Well, West Virginia is further along statistically, but Virginia has done really well. Of course, as with other states, in the out years, they have to do more with agriculture and stormwater.
By the way, just to mention briefly, New York was also a contributor. One doesn't think of it that way. What's New York's contribution to all of this?
New York's contribution isn't huge, but it's in the Susquehanna River, and so like Pennsylvania, it's contributing to the Susquehanna problem. And New York's always been kind of like a reluctant player in the Bay effort. I think it's safe to say that they view themselves as being far upstream. The part of New York that's in the Bay watershed tends to be economically depressed. And they also have a wastewater treatment plant in Binghamton. It's the largest wastewater treatment plant in New York's portion of the watershed. And there's been problems with upgrades they tried to do at that plant. They didn't really work. And so unlike the other states that made some wastewater treatment plant gains, that's not happened in New York. And so that there's still a fair amount that New York has to do yet. That's not of the magnitude of Pennsylvania, but it kind of exacerbates the problem that they're both contributing to the Susquehanna River, which comes down. It's obviously the biggest river to the bay. It contributes half the water to the bay.
So turning to Maryland, where we are, how do you assess how the state has approached trying to deal with pollution, whether it's wastewater treatment or obviously here on the Eastern Shore, agriculture and stormwater in particular are the big ticket items?
Yeah, Maryland, I think most people credit Maryland with having some of the best programs to address the nutrient pollution to the bay, for wastewater, stormwater, agriculture all the way around. That said, they have a long ways to go, and that's because of a bunch of little things that add up to them having further to go between now and 2025 than they originally thought. They upgraded the computer models that they use to assess impacts on the bay and progress, and some of those changes increased Maryland's impact on the bay. Part of it's because Maryland is really close to the bay, and so nutrients that come from the eastern and western shores, a higher proportion of those nutrients actually reach the bay than they do from other states. In the new model, nitrogen tends to be a little bit more important relative to phosphorus, and that affects Maryland a bit. The Potomac Basin is a little bit more important to the bay water quality, and that contributes a little bit. But significantly, in recent years, they've done a lot of work to update the data that's used, and that data showed that in Maryland, there's like more fertilizer being applied than they thought, and there's more farm animals. You see, on the eastern shore, you see obviously more chicken houses and things, and so that's meant that some of the nutrient inputs had been underestimated, and so that's added up to make Maryland's job a bit more challenging than they would have thought like a year ago.
By the way, how do you assess the Maryland Phosphorus Management Program? Is that enough? I know it got delayed. There was some critique about whether it went far enough. What sense do you get about that?
My sense is that it has made a bit of a difference. It looks to me, just overall, it looks to me like Maryland is on track to meet its phosphorus goal, and so I think that that's not going to be a big problem for them, as long as they keep up the efforts that are underway.
I mean, the big issue, I guess, here in terms of pollution has been nitrogen. And some have suggested, by the way, that the soil itself is so saturated with nitrogen, whether it's from past uses or just that it's inherent in the soil, that it's going to be very difficult to get a reduction in that from leaching into the bay. What sense do you get about where we are and how manageable that is?
Well, you have two problems, especially on the eastern shore, that are difficult. It's the phosphorus that's kind of in areas where they apply lots of chicken manure. The phosphorus has really saturated the soils, and that's going to leach out for a long time. Similarly, the nitrogen from decades ago leached down into the groundwater. Groundwater moves really slow on the eastern shore, and some of the nitrogen that was applied in the 1960s in some places is only now starting to reach the bay, and so you're right. There's some significant time lags from some of those past activities that are going to take a long time to work through the system.
In terms of the health of the bay, I mean, how do you assess that? We've had a number of assessments. There have been some improvements in, for instance, the underwater grasses, blue crabs, and so on. What are we seeing, do you think, from the bay that indicates that we might be making some progress here?
One of the closest indicators that I look at, and a lot of other people do, is underwater grasses, because underwater grasses really respond to water quality, particularly clarity, because they need lots of sunlight to survive, and they're also really important habitats for juvenile crabs and fish and waterfowl. And so it's an important resource. It's got a really tight connection to water quality. And last year, the amount of underwater grasses, went over the 100,000 acre mark, which is the highest it's been in decades and decades. It's about 3 times where it was in the mid-1980s when cleanup efforts really started. And that's, to me, a clear indication that things have been improving. And there was a scientific paper out this year that made a pretty good case that link to underwater grass recovery was stemming from nutrient reductions over time in the bay. Similarly, if you look at dissolved oxygen levels in the deep portion of the bay, the dead zone, those have slowly improved in the worst places over time, and the dead zone is disappearing earlier at the end of summer than it used to be the case, which is a sign that the algae, the dissolved oxygen levels decline because of algae. The algae, when there's too much algae, it sinks to the bottom of the bay. It's decomposed by bacteria, it uses up the oxygen. And when the dead zone breaks up earlier at the end of summer, that means that the amount of nutrients coming into the bay has been reduced, and and the amount of algae that's left at the end of summer is less. So there's definitely some signs that what they've been doing has been helping, and if they'd done nothing, the bay would have been considerably worse today than it is.
By the way, how important, in terms of agriculture, how important are the cover crops? I mean, do they do as much as we would like them to do in terms of keeping pollution from the bay?
Yeah, cover crops are a really good way to help the bay because they help absorb the excess nitrogen, and importantly for farmers, a lot of the nutrient reduction actions that farms can take tend to reduce productions or take farmland out of production, and a cover crop doesn't do either of those, so it doesn't reduce your productivity, and in fact there's evidence that the cover crops, if they get plowed into the ground or are left on the ground at the end, they can actually help the soil health and improve productivity, and so cover crops can be a big benefit.
So the other thing is, you indicate that maybe the good news is that as we move forward with the cleanup could come faster than as you get closer to the goal. What you suggested that in your piece. What do you mean by that?
That is the hope, because some of the scientists believe that there's evidence that the dissolved oxygen levels in the worst part of the bay. This gets into a chemical process more complex than we want to describe here, but
right.
But there's some evidence that oxygen levels in the worst part of the bay have improved better than they would have, or more than they would have predicted, just from nitrogen reductions alone, which is evidence they think that those reductions have allowed a process to kick in where Mother Nature, in a sense, they've given Mother Nature a chance to help to kick in a chemical process that is further improving oxygen conditions in the bay. Similarly, when you get really large underwater grass beds, they tend to improve water quality in the surrounding areas, which allows those beds to expand even more. And so people talk about this as being a tipping point. When you get to a certain level, Mother Nature kind of helps out by allowing grass beds or oxygen conditions to improve a little bit more than just the nutrient reductions would have produced by themselves. And there's some evidence, there's some reason to believe that's happening.
Are you optimistic that we can get on track to clean up the bay? And do you think we will actually meet those 2025 numbers, or do you think it might be a little further out?
I don't think they can meet. I think few people who look at those numbers seriously think that the 2025 goals can be met by 2025. We can certainly make progress by 2025. I mean, Pennsylvania has certainly ramped up its efforts recently and has taken the obligation more seriously in the past year or so than was the case. I think few people think that Pennsylvania could get to where they need to be by 2025, because the amount that they would have to ramp up is almost impossible. But certainly as long as everyone keeps doing what they're doing and ramps up efforts, we should have a better bay in 2025 than we do today. One thing, I tell people, I started writing about the bay in 1990, and back then the cleanup goal was to have everything done by 2000, and I thought in 2000 I'd be looking for another job. Since then, I've watched a number of goals be set and missed, and it's easy to become cynical about the effort. But when you take a step back and look at the Bay, it's clearly better today than it was in the mid-1980s by almost any measure that you would use. And as long as the cleanup effort continues, I would expect it to continue to improve, even if we don't hit the goals. At the same time, I think it's important for people to realize, we're not going to turn back the clock and have, the Bay of the past. There's just more people in the watershed. There's more hardened shorelines. The climate's changing. The Bay of the future is going to be different than the Bay of the past, regardless of whether we meet the goals. But we can have a better Bay than we would otherwise have in the future, as long as we keep working on this long-term effort to reduce nutrients. We are seeing responses, and I would expect that to continue into the future.
Yeah, we've been talking actually about a lot of the local efforts, but what kind of impact do you see in terms of climate change, something that we at the local level, whether it's any of the individual states, find it very difficult to do anything about unless something happens dramatically? What kind of impact do you think climate change is having on all of this? And does it make it harder?
Yeah, there's two parts to the answer. One is the climate's going to change the Bay, physically, because the sea levels are going to be higher. There's going to be eventually fewer marshes around the Bay. The Bay is going to be warmer. There's going to be a lot of changes in the Bay itself. The species makeup's going to change and stuff. In the nutrient equation, it is expected that it will make nutrient reductions more difficult over time, largely because there's been a long-term trend towards increased precipitation in the watershed, and there's suggestions that there's also increased storm intensity and increased rain, and increasingly severe storms tend to wash more nutrients off the landscape than would otherwise be the case. And so there's reason to think that more nutrients will be coming down in the Bay under, with climate change than would otherwise be the case. And so that's going to require more work to offset in the future.
We've been speaking with Carl Blankenship. He is editor of the Bay Journal and taking an extensive look really at the problems that lie ahead in terms of cleaning up the Bay. I think it's a 4-part series on it, so people should check out the website. And Carl, appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Okay, thanks for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.